China has faced so many civil wars throughout its history. Did India face such crises in the past? If yes, then why and when did it happen? If no, then why did China have to face so many civil wars but India did not? I don't think India has faced civil wars. There was a threatened civil war in 1946, Direct Action Day, which was threatened by Jinnah, that if you want to give me the partition of India and Pakistan, then I will give you a civil war. It never happened. But in India's history, we've never had civil wars, as far as I know. We've had the occupation of India by extremely evil foreign forces, the Turks and the Europeans, and they perpetrated all kinds of atrocities on India, genocides, but we didn't have civil war. What is civil war? Civil war is the people or people fighting the government. So it's chaos all around. We've never had that in India. Never. We've had wars between kingdoms and all that, but civilians were never involved. But what about China? China, if you look at the history of the past roughly 2000 years, I'm sure you can find at least 20 incidences of civil war, which is roughly one civil war every century, which is staggering actually. And some of these civil wars have had death tolls that are astonishingly staggering. For example, the Taiping rebellion that happened in the 19th century had a death toll of 20, 30 million people in just about 10, 15 years. Then you had the An-Lushan rebellion in the 8th century, which had a death toll about 30 million. And so many other. The Dongan revolt that happened again in the 19th century, which was between the Chinese and the Hui people, the Muslims of East Turkestan, that had a death toll of about, I don't know, at least 10 million. In the Chinese Civil War, from the 1920s to about 1949, 1950, that had a death toll of at least 10 million. So you have these repeated cycles in China, the imperial cycles that always end with a civil war. Roughly one civil war every century. And the death toll is typically astonishing, crazy. And you have famines that usually accompany these civil wars. And in some of these civil wars, you had instances of widespread cannibalism in China. So China has had this pattern, historical pattern. Civil wars, roughly one every century, and complete chaos in the country, in the kingdom, in the empire, whatever you want to call it. But India has never had that. Why is that so, right? Is a very good question. So it's to do with culture, it's to do with geography, it's to do with so many things like that. Culture, geography. So uh, there is something called the Northern China Plain. So let's Google the North China Plain, shall we? Uh, where? Okay, not the map. We will Google the North China Plain. Here we are, North China Plain. So this is a region. Let's go to the images of that. So it is this part of China that you see highlighted in orange. That is historically the heartland of China. The current day nation of China, it encompasses territories that have historically never been Chinese. But let's not discuss that right now. This highlighted region is the North China Plain, and a couple of rivers are the bedrock of Chinese civilization. Just a few rivers, the Yellow River, the Mekong, etc., the Huang Ho, the Mekong, and couple of 2 3 rivers are the rivers that have sustained Chinese civilization the past roughly 2000 3000 years. So now we go to the map. So this western part of China has been the heartland of China, and that's where Chinese empires have already always taken root, in this region. India, on the other hand, is very different. India is a river valley civilization. There are rivers that crisscross the length and the breadth of the Indian subcontinent, all the way across the subcontinent, starting from Gandhar, Afghanistan, all the way to wherever you look in the subcontinent. India is a river valley civilization. China is not. Then China has historically had one language, one culture, and one ethnicity. Not the whole of China as we see it today, but historical, that part of China, the North China plain that I showed you, that historically has had one culture, one language, one ethnicity. That is the Han culture, the Han Chinese language, and so on. And that's where you've always had the emergence of kingdoms or empires. Now, in China, there's always been this concept. So, so the Chinese civilization begins roughly around the 3rd century BC with the Qin dynasty. And you've had major dynasties like the Qin dynasty, the Han dynasty, the Tang dynasty, the Ming dynasty, the Yuan, which is a conquest dynasty, Shri Chinggis Khan, and so on. But so on. So you had these dynasties, and the Chinese have always had this concept called the mandate of heaven. What's the mandate of heaven? It's the idea that there can only be one legitimate ruler of China at any given point in time. And China obviously is like all culture civilizations, its boundaries have risen and fallen. The boundaries change over time, always. So the mandate of heaven is this idea that there can only be one legitimate ruler of China at any given point in time. That's the mandate of heaven. And this concept, this idea, suggests that a dynasty's rule is sanctioned by the gods, by divine approval. And this mandate of the gods can be lost if the dynasty fails to govern effectively. And in that case, if the mandate of heaven is lost, then it is a duty of the people to rebel against the dynasty and throw it down. And that is what gives rise to the imperial cycles, the rise of a dynasty and empire, which kind of consolidates that region and the rule within it. And because it does well initially, it has the mandate of heaven and it ascends to glory. And eventually, like every dynasty, every empire, it starts doing poorly. It loses the mandate of heaven. And then there's a period of disaster, of chaos, of civil war, which can last a decade, it can last a century, and then a new dynasty comes. And a new imperial cycle starts. That has been the pattern of Chinese history. Now, in Chinese history, the culture has been the Confucian Taoist culture, the Confucian culture, which is the legalistic culture. It's all about obeying the authorities and all that, as opposed to the dharmic culture that we have in India. So in China, 2000 years we've had Buddhism roughly, but the emperors have never followed Buddhism. They've always been Confucians, and that's the kind of thing it is. So it's a cultural difference, and also the mandate of heaven thing, and that's why China has had these horrific civil wars over and over and over again. In India also has at times been unified under one dynasty, one empire. We have so many examples: the Mauryan Empire, the Gupta Empire, the Kushan Empire, the Karkota Empire, the Chola Empire, the Maratha Empire. So many, I can name so many more. But India is fundamentally very different from China. In what ways is India fundamentally different from China? We are not a monoculture like China is. Today, the nation of China is so large, they've taken so many territories from other peoples that it's a multi ethnic nation. But historically, the Chinese were the Han people, a monoculture, one language, one ethnicity, one culture. In India, Hinduism, the ism that we attribute to the Hindus, that itself is so incredibly diverse. There are so many philosophical schools of thought. There are so many customs and traditions that have been incorporated and absorbed into Hinduism. It's so diverse and it's completely decentralized. And there are so many languages, hundreds of languages and thousands of dialects in India. So, because of this incredible diversity, India genetically is the most diverse part of the planet apart from Africa. And yet it is genetically uniform. It's a very strange conundrum. So, because of this diversity, and because of having this plentiful abundance of water and river valleys and all that, we have, between the times when India was unified under one empire, we've had so many periods where India was fragmented into all these little kingdoms, sometimes big kingdoms, sometimes little kingdoms. And in India, the culture is the dharmic culture, which is at its fundamental level a culture that prioritizes non-violence, avoidable violence. Of course, if violence is required, we've resorted to violence, like Lord Krishna said, destroy the non to achieve dharma, achieve non-violence, you have to destroy the violent, right? That way. But the Indian way of warfare was very different. When kingdoms went to war, they never touched the civilians and so on. We know the thing. That's why we have never had civil wars, because of all these factors, which are very different from the Chinese paradigm, the Chinese context. That's why India has never had civil wars in which civilians get involved. Almost, I can't think of any time period. Probably one, no, that's not a civil war, right? That's the first war of independence, 1857. That was not a civil war. It was a subcontinent wide uprising against the British occupiers, which failed at the time, but yeah, that's how it went. So these are the reasons why India and China have had such different trajectories, historical trajectories. China has these imperial cycles and civil war after civil war. India has never had that. This is another question that historians have never bothered to take up. You can write a PhD on this topic too. A comparative study of the historical evolution and trajectory of Indian and Chinese civilizations with a focus on the civil war and the dynastic cycle and imperial cycle and the lack of it in India. Such an interesting topic. Nobody bothers to do that. What can I say?